Let me turn back to the issue of civil disobedience for a moment. This has been an issue that people have dealt with since the time of Antigone, through Thoreau, Gandhi, King. They all use civil disobedience. Have they all used it the same way? And what is the role, generally, of civil disobedience as a form of political participation?
Civil disobedience gets around a fundamental barrier. If you don't have voting rights, how can you get voting rights? It seems like a simple question, but it's actually a very complicated challenge. How do you get the laws to change when you literally have no direct influence on the law? The way that the civil rights movement took on that question was through civil disobedience. The difference between Thoreau and Martin Luther King and the other leadership organizations was the use of the media. So if there are television cameras rolling and national media audiences, we would see certain types of images that we had not seen before. For example, in Selma, Alabama, the voter registration board was only open 1 or 2 days a month, and even during those days had very long lunch hours and other ways of harming the people who were lined up. The media image of well-dressed African-American citizens lined up for blocks in front of that voter registration building and then being literally pushed out by the local police force. When it comes to the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, the image of thousands of young black men and women being set upon by city police forces and state forces, literally beaten bloody until they have to force a retreat to churches and then hospitals. These images looked like a war. And to that audience that is new, the price of that intransigence is going to be national attention against the white community. That's how civil disobedience worked in Selma, and it was remarkably quick. These actions began in January. The first march was in March of 1965, and the Voting Rights Act is signed in August of 1965. While it was a long time coming, almost 100 years since the 15th Amendment was ratified, the rapid movement of that particular campaign was helped by the media.
So was the justification for breaking the law to shine a light on an unjust law, or were there other justifications put forward?
Yes. So the reason to engage in civil disobedience is to get attention. It depends how the punishment is exacted. So again, being put into jail is certainly an action that is going to get attention. But of course, even more so, having the police force put a hose on children, and that's the Children's March in Birmingham, which is somewhat separate from the Voting Rights March. That image of a black child being put in harm's way by the very people who are supposed to protect the community provides the moral authority to widen the scope of conflict. And even though we think that liberal organizations do not use religion very much anymore, and in fact we have some differences in behavior in American government today based on religiosity, the truth is the civil rights movement used religious language and truths very much as they use the Declaration and the Constitution. So civil disobedience became a moral imperative, not just a legal and political movement, to fulfill the promises not only of the founders of the United States, but also for biblical prophecies.
I think you've pretty much summed up the common arguments for civil disobedience. And if you haven't, please feel free to say other arguments. What are the arguments against it?
Well, the argument against it is that the law is the law for a reason, and that laws have a very rigorous background to become part of the fabric of a community. Think about how complicated checks and balances are, not just at the national level, but at the state and local level. Think about the complications of our legal process. The argument against civil disobedience is that the laws are on the books because they not only reflect the will of the majority, but that they also had gone through their own rigorous debates and rigorous examinations.
Can you describe some of the most prominent groups that have advocated advances in civil rights in the recent past? How successful have they been?
Well, if you think about gay rights, it's probably the most important success story since the civil rights movement, as well as women's rights. So we'll start with those two. So gay rights is more prominent right now in American political discussions, and that includes the right to marry, the right to adopt children, and to avoid discrimination in employment and housing. These types of ordinances were really unthinkable a generation ago, except in certain communities like San Francisco and other communities that had a higher proportion of gay residents. Today, a lot of these rules are nationalized, especially on marriage, through the Supreme Court. And the reason why that's a success story is that it happened pretty rapidly. For people who hatched these ideas and for the legal community that fostered them through voluntary associations, including interest groups like the Human Rights Campaign and Lambda Legal Foundation, these ideas are not really new. They were begun many decades ago. For women's rights, going back toward the 60s and 70s, we have to remember that the right to vote, while established in the Constitution, was one of many rights that women's groups wanted. One of the most important changes in women's lives in the past 40 and 50 to 50 years is about employment law. So if we think about the simplest thing that we take for granted today, if you're pregnant, can you be fired for being pregnant? Can you be fired for looking pregnant at an interview? Can you be fired for having intentions of becoming pregnant in the future? Well, young women today, of course, would be appalled by such questions, but that was very much in the law in the 1960s, as late as that. It wasn't until the 1970s where women were able to have fair employment protections. Other groups that have sought and received protections include older Americans, as well as disabled Americans through the Americans with Disabilities Act. Think about the accommodations that are required at the state and local level, as well as at the federal level, for people who are in wheelchairs, for people like in standardized tests who have learning disabilities. There are a lot of accommodations that we need to make, and a lot of employers who might otherwise be able to fire a disabled person are not allowed to do so anymore.
So let's conclude the lesson by asking, what today do you think are the most prominent civil rights issues? You mentioned, obviously, a few just a moment ago, but what do you think today is the most prominent?
In 2016, I think going back at least 1 or 2 years, what we see now is an African-American movement regarding the criminal justice system and the conduct of community police officers. While that might sound like a very simple question to answer, it actually is very complicated because it has to do with the tension between majority rule and minority rights. Criminal law, including drug sentencing law, is passed at a majority level, usually through the United States Congress, but for state criminal law, it would be at the state legislative level. And when individuals or groups say that they are being oppressed by majority rule, it's very complicated to push back. But what we've seen recently, again, as I mentioned, with Eric Gardner in Staten Island and with Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and in other cases, we see communities spontaneously responding. Those responses get attention, both positive and negative, but it certainly brings the attention to the larger community. So for example, with criminal sentencing, there's been an interesting coalition in recent years between conservatives, who used to be tough on crime, and African American community leaders who are worried about disproportionate imprisonment of black men especially. So what's interesting, as I said before, is that in any successful civil rights movement, you have to bring in people who are not directly affected. So why are white conservatives very interested in police conduct and in uniform sentencing? And the answer is money. It's not just a moral obligation, it's an economic burden to have a disproportionate number of people in a community not only not working, but of course prisons are costing a lot of money at the state and local level as well as at the federal level. So this has been a successful but still controversial type of new civil rights movement. A final example would be on immigration. So do majorities have the right to explain what a criminal trespassing law would be? For example, If you are driving and you're an undocumented immigrant, can that be suspicious in and of itself? Well, Arizona has experimented with the idea that the police have the right to ask for documentation of any person regardless of what the actual stop was for. And those are the types of civil rights questions that have gone through the federal court system recently.